Well, I want to turn to some stories in the Gospels, and if you want to follow along, we're going to be looking at several stories. We already had the first one, but let's go back to it again. And I'm reading from the New International Version, but feel free to follow along in whatever translation you find best. So the first story is in Matthew 12. And verses 9 to 13. And each of these stories I'll give a little title to. The first one I'll call the Withered Hand Man. Jesus went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, the Pharisees asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, as sound as the other. The next story is in Mark chapter 1 and verses 21 and on. Mark chapter 1. This is the story of the demon-possessed man. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then there was a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit, and he cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. Next story, Luke chapter 4 and verse 38. This is the story of Peter's mother-in-law. I don't suppose many of us think about the domestic arrangements of the disciples, but obviously Peter was married. I'd like to know more about Mrs. Peter, but this is a story about her mother. Luke 4:38. That Sabbath, Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wait on them. Story number 4. Luke chapter 13, and starting with verse 10. This is what I call the story of the bent-over woman. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on one of those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" Story number 5, Luke chapter 14. This is the dropsy man. And some of us used to make fun of dropsy whenever anyone dropped something, but this is not that kind of disease. This is a serious disease that many translations call an abnormal swelling of the body. Luke 14:1. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in a house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from an abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" Story number 6. This is the Bethesda pool crippled man story in John chapter 5. John chapter 5, and starting with verse 5. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want me to make you well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And finally, John chapter 9 and verses 1 to 14. This is the born blind man. John 9, starting at the beginning. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming, when no man can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Silang." So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "Well, this man they called Jesus made some mud and put it in my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and now I can see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. I'm sure by now you have noticed that there is a common theme to these stories. And I am grateful for Alex Bryan, the senior pastor of the Walla Walla University Church, for pointing out that what ties these stories together is something that might be a little bit of a surprise to Seventh-day Adventists. And he does this in his excellent essay called The Heart of Adventist Faith, which is in the book Do Justice, published by the Signs Publishing. And Pastor Bryan points out that in every one of these cases, what is involved is a chronic condition, not sudden, unavoidable, immediate needs. Jesus showed that the Sabbath is an appropriate time to intervene and to help. Sabbath keeping by Jesus was also about routine healing, compassion, and wholeness. Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, or for human beings. The purpose was humane. It was humanitarian. And so Sabbatarians who are not humane are not Sabbath keepers, according to Jesus. Now, some of us have grown up with the concept that the only appropriate time for helping people on the Sabbath is if there is an emergency, but not any other time. But that's not the theme of these stories. As the Pharisees pointed out, can't you come on Sunday or Monday? And Jesus said, no, the Sabbath is the time for being concerned about people's needs. So that makes us begin to scratch our head perhaps and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the Sabbath? Now, for those of us who have grown up in this community, one answer we might say is, well, it's worship. And it's true. There is this element of worship on Sabbath day, and that's what we're doing today. But Jesus didn't go out of his way to emphasize that in his preaching, teaching, or in his practice. If we have to give a second answer, we might say, well, the real reason for Sabbath is rest. Again, true. Many of us are extremely grateful for the rest we get on Sabbath. But Jesus didn't go out of his way to emphasize rest either. Jesus connects Sabbath with healing, with compassion, with reaching out to the needy. Consider Jesus' ministry and go to where he made that signature statement when he announced his ministry and what he had come to do. And we know that's found in Luke chapter 4 and verses 18 and 19. If you check your notes, you'll find that he's referring to Isaiah chapter 61 and the first couple of verses. Now, if you were given the task of introducing Jesus, or if you imagined for one moment that you were Jesus and you were coming to introduce yourself, what would be the place that you would go to find your raison d'etre, the reason why you were there? I can imagine that some of us would say, well, we have to go to the sanctuary service and find there the type and the antitype and the sacrifices and so forth. Someone else would say, no, we need to go to Daniel and make sure we get all the prophecies lined up and that everything's happening according to the right time. But Jesus didn't do any of those things. Neither did he refer to all of the texts that hint at the glorious ascendancy of a powerful king who would come to change everything. And of course, that's what the disciples and all of the people of Israel were devoutly looking for, someone who would come and thrash the Romans and bring them up to the pinnacle of success. No, instead, Jesus had this to say. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has appointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And here he is introducing an idea that his hearers would absolutely understand, the concept of Jubilee, the sabbatical system of Leviticus, rich with compassion. The Jubilee introduced compassion for the earth. Today we would talk about environmental protection, and we would get out our green badges. The Jubilee talked about compassion for the slave. The Jubilee introduced compassion for the widow, for the orphan, for the man in debt. Reference after reference in the Jubilee was to the poor and those in distress. These are the words that spring from the culture of the Bible. Now, if we were introducing that today in the 21st century, we might use those terms. We might use others as well. We might say that Jubilee must introduce compassion for the refugee, for the internally displaced person, for those who are in distress from disasters and famines. Right now you must be following the news about Tropical Cyclone Winston that struck Fiji. And I hope you're excited to hear that AIIAS is on the ground, working with Seventh-day Adventist church members to provide assistance to those who have suffered so terribly. Compassion for the victims of sex trafficking, the new slavery of the 20th and 21st century. For those who are denied basic human rights. Compassion for those who have no access to education and to health. Now, Seventh-day Adventists have long said, from the very beginning, that the Sabbath will be a critical issue at the end of history. How will this play out? Of course, we have many scenarios, and we talk about the different possibilities of what might happen. But in the light of the stories that we have read today, as we've gone back into what Jesus had to say, is it just a matter of the calendar, or is it also a matter of how we connect with our neighbor, with people? Let's ask this in the context of Jesus' teaching, mission, and practice. And the answer may surprise us. Because seventh-day living promotes 7-day-a-week humanitarianism. And for some of us, that's an uneasy transition to make in our minds. I remember being part of a church in Western Canada years ago, and we had come up with the plan to go from door to door and collect food to give to the local food bank. It was a charity that provided food for people who did not have enough. And we thought we would also do this at the same time as we did our ingathering, or our collection for ADRA. And we discussed what day we would do this. And some thought it should be done on the Sabbath. But others said, no, we can't go around collecting food on the Sabbath. That would break the Sabbath. And the church came together and took a vote on it. And the vote said we would not do this work on Sabbath. Now, I'm glad to say that when we came back to this same practice the next year, we took another vote, and this time the church said, surely Jesus would be out there on the Sabbath collecting food for the hungry. Let's do it on the Sabbath. I remember a few years ago we had a typhoon here in the Philippines, and a lot of aid was sent from overseas in a great big Hercules C-140, and the plane arrived at Manila International Airport on Sabbath. And we were notified that the plane had to be unloaded immediately or the aid would not be available. Now, it just so happens that some of my colleagues who were there on that day are in the congregation, and you will remember how we all gathered together and went out onto the burning heat of the airstrip with our truck and forklift, and we unloaded the aircraft and we got all the supplies, the emergency supplies for the needy. And I'm just so thrilled to have been part of that exercise. Now, we've covered a great deal about the seventh day, because I want to talk about the Seventh-day Adventists. So for a few moments, let's also look at the second half of the name of our church. I've emphasized seventh day. Let's go to the next word, Adventist, or Adventism. Seventh-day Adventists, we hear and repeat the announcements of the soon coming of Jesus Christ. Jesus is coming again to make this world right. And we share this news repeatedly. And Jesus talked about this repeatedly. And he emphasized how this would happen. And he told some wonderful stories. We call them parables. And one of the most important I find in Matthew chapter 25. And I think of it as the great final exam. Now, we're in an academic setting, so I know that many of you encounter exams, tests, quizzes from time to time. And I will confess to you that at no point in my academic career did I ever enjoy tests, quizzes, or exams. Some of you may be different. But Matthew 25 talks about the great exam that we will all face. And it says there, starting with verse 31, When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on his throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. He'll set the sheep on his right hand, the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." A good thing about this exam is it was over before it started, it seems, because the answer was already announced. And he then goes on to explain how those who had passed the exam had done so. And I hope your professors, teachers, whatever, also do this in the classroom, because it's not just enough to know that you got an A, B, C, D, or F, but why you got that grade. And Jesus does that here, the king. And he says in verse 35, "For I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, I was a stranger and you took me in, I was naked and you clothed me, I was sick and you visited me, I was in prison and you came to me." And I can just imagine in the story, a story that we are looking forward to, by the way, that those on the right hand of the Father looking up at this immortal, all-powerful God, their eyes open wide and they cannot understand the words, and they say, "When did we see you a stranger? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty? Or sick or in prison?" And then the king, verse 40, explains, and he says to them, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me." So the final exam is not on the 27, 28, or whatever number we get to by the time Jesus comes again, doctrines. It's not whether we have correctly identified the king of the north, or whether we can interpret Daniel correctly, or whether we have the right hermeneutical principles, or whether we have the right exegesis, and any of the other big words that the seminarians are studying here. Instead, the king asks, "Were you compassionate?" How can we do this? How can we be compassionate? Let me suggest a few ways. We can engage our neighbors in our local communities with the challenges that confront them. Secondly, we can speak up and act where it is possible to ensure that those who don't have access to basic resources like water and food. 1 billion people on our planet do not have access to such things. We can make sure they do. We can energetically confront the issues of our time: poverty, abuse, hatred, violence, and sexual crimes. We can end institutionalized racial segregation and any other form of bias that exists in our communities. We can ensure that women are treated with dignity and given the same opportunities as men in so many of our communities where they are not. In other words, we can think and act globally. Now, you will not be surprised that I suggest that when you're thinking of acting globally, you participate with the Adventist Agency for that purpose, which of course is ADRA. And that's why if you got a bulletin, which I didn't, but I think you will see that the title of my sermon is SDADRA, which is impossible to pronounce, SDADRA or something, but I've put there Seventh-day Adventist Development and Relief Agency, packaging together these two concepts with the agency that the church has established for this purpose. So when we say that Jesus is coming again, what is the picture in our minds? What are we looking for? What will this new world look like? Can you imagine at all that it's going to be a continuation or a repetition of the same disastrous experience that we have on this planet so far? Surely not. Surely the picture that you have of heaven, of the new earth, of Eden restored, does not include babies struggling to breathe. It does not include mothers dying in childbirth. Does not have children with their limbs blown off by improvised explosive devices or sniper bullets. It does not have a picture of fathers despairingly and unsuccessfully searching for work in order to get enough money to feed their families. No. Surely the picture that you have in your mind, the picture that Jesus has given us, that Scripture constantly presents us with, is a humane world, a compassionate world. That's the Adventist message for us, may I suggest. So, looking at the two halves of our name, the Lord of the Sabbath calls us to compassion. The Lord of the Second Advent calls us to compassion. So Seventh-day Adventists, richly compassionate, richly humanitarian. I want to share with you a song sung by a friend of mine, Christine Wallman, who's a Seventh-day Adventist artist who lives in Western Canada, in Winnipeg. And she sings a song in which she says, we can change the world with faith, hope, and love.
Change